Hey, welcome back to the Invisible Strength podcast. Today, we are going deep into grief and growth. Grief is rooted within each of us. We often think about it as losing someone, but how does it show up when living with an autoimmune disease? It's not just sadness, it's the ache of losing your old self and the sting of isolation. We'll explore the hidden layers of grief, share strategies to effectively process it, and learn how to ultimately find peace and joy. Chris, grief is such a part of us, and I think it's bigger than we realize. But how do you think about grief at its core?
Grief, to your point, I think is one of the foundational emotions and experiences of what it means to be human. The sense of loss, and it can show up in so many different ways. Grief is often associated with death of something, more specifically, the death of someone. But I think we grieve different seasons. I think about when I will get a memory on my phone of my sons being toddlers, and I'll like kind of miss, oh, they were so little and precious. Like, they're still here with me just at a different stage of life, but I will sometimes grieve the transition, or thinking about when you're going from high school to college, or when you've changed jobs and you think about your friends and your routine that you used to have. Grief can show up in so many different ways, but I do think at the core of it all is humans trying to deal with loss, right? Obviously, I'm saying humans just for our intents and purposes. Grief is something that we see expressed in the animal kingdom. Elephants have a practice of grief. They mourn when another elephant is lost. But just thinking about the ways in which we handle grief and how we deal with loss specifically, whether it be of a season, something tangible, or of a person.
That's an interesting perspective because initially you go to the loss of a person or a specific thing versus seasons of life. That's something we very much experience with these conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ways in which we were able to perform, like our ability, our able-bodiedness can go away and come back, or just be permanently gone depending on the chronic illness. So there's absolutely a grief over the loss of independence, loss of mobility, loss of function. Maybe you're no longer able to work full time or work in the same field where you used to work. So you could have grief about that. Maybe you've had to change your diet and you grieve not being able to eat the meals that were central to the times you were hanging out with your family or friends. Like, there's so many ways that grief shows up. And I think something that's really important, Karin, is that we don't always know it's grief, right? So my grief does not necessarily mean I look sad. My grief could show up, particularly thinking about men in general. My grief could show up as anger, or my grief could show up as a form of anxiety where I'm trying to control everything. I'm trying to make sure things stay exactly the way that makes me feel safe. And because life is impossible to control, I'm always feeling anxious about things. That can be a symptom of my grief as well. So it's not just about looking sad or seeming depressed. Grief can show up in a variety of different ways. Bargaining, we talk about different stages of grief, but grief doesn't have to look like sadness. It can look like frustration, anger, anxiety, a variety of different modalities.
I feel that I've gone through multiple surgeries, and there has been so much frustration in not being able to do what I previously could do.
Sure, for sure.
I remember going through that period of anger and frustration before I could really like sit in the sadness to
Yeah,
move on.
yeah, totally. Because it's just such a shock to the system when you are diagnosed, right? Not all of us are educated about chronic illnesses. It wasn't even on the radar for us when we were getting sick. I've talked to so many folks within our community who remember never being sick. Like, they never had to call out of work. They were never slowed down by health. And then they just get hit with this tidal wave of all these different ways that, in my words, from my own journey with lupus, the ways in which your body has betrayed you. It really feels like your body just leaves you and abandons you. And that can be a tremendous form of grief. I remember speaking to a coaching client who talked about their ability to play sports and their success, prowess at playing sports, and now struggling to even do a solitary push up. So, just the ways in which all of us can remember what we used to do. And something that I said to someone recently is that I believe it's critical for us in this community to disabuse ourselves of this idea of back to normal. There's no such thing as back to normal. You and I will never go back to whatever life was before that. Like, so much time has passed, but we have become very different people because of how we've adapted to and worked through and I would say triumphed through the difficulties and challenges of our condition. So I think this whole notion of going back to this world where lupus or Sjogren's or fibromyalgia was never on the radar, it's just not possible.
How do we can appreciate our old selves, but pivot? You don't want to wallow in the weight of your former self, but you can appreciate what you've accomplished and who you are currently because of those experiences. How do you respect that, but not get stuck there?
Karen, I think, and it may sound silly, but I think Taylor Swift and Beyonce are very instructive examples of this. Thinking about Taylor Swift and her eras, she has like a new album coming out and she's going into another era. I guess it's like a showgirl era or whatever the case is. And I think about Beyonce with like her Act One and Act Two, and maybe Act Three is going to be sort of like a rock album going from the country album that she just put out. But this way of understanding your life, and this is true for everyone, right? Not just us within the autoimmune community. We all go through different changes and different eras of life, right? So if you can remember what it was like to be in elementary school, that's very different than being in middle school and far different, light years away from being in college. Same with being a single person, and then you're dating, and maybe you get married, and maybe you have kids, and maybe the kids move out of the house, and maybe become a grandparent. There's all these different eras that we go through just as people. So when you add that to the conditions that we have, we can think about it in terms of the different stages of hearing the diagnosis and not knowing what to do, having the fear of saying, how am I going to sustain myself? Can I keep a job? Can I work? How am I going to go to all these different appointments? So maybe you've gotten to a place where you're like, you know what, I'm able to manage my symptoms. And maybe you've gotten to a point where now you're hearing good news for the first time from the doctors, where they're able to take labs and see, oh, wow, you're showing improvement in this area. You still have these challenges, but this challenge is really being handled. Or maybe you're saying, I'm going to go do my first walk for the particular condition I have, or I'm going to join a support group, or I'm going to join coaching sessions, all of these different steps that you take and ways that you evolve through it. You know, I going back to another musical reference, I really appreciate the way in which jazz has movements, right? Like, you're not hearing the same sound all throughout the song. The song continues to evolve. And I think our lives also have movements where, yes, I'm not able to do what I was doing in my early 20s, but there are things that I'm able to do now because of the experience and the knowledge and expertise I've developed that my early 20 something self knew nothing about. So there are still wins here. And if we have this very generative outlook and saying, what are the things I've learned and where are the ways I'm improving myself, in spite of this impediment, in spite of these difficulties, then we're able to have a hopeful orientation rather than a despair-filled one.
Those are invaluable learnings as you've gone through different experiences of grief in various stages of your life.
Right.
But whatever season you're in those periods of grief, how do we process it?
Yeah, sure. So the stages are not linear, right? Like, it's not, I'm going to go through shock and then I'm going to go through anger and then I'm going through bargaining. It doesn't happen that way. Grief, I believe, is best described. And this was how my part of my training is in pastoral care. It's how my pastoral care professor once described it, as grief happens in waves. So I think about the way that my grandmother passed away coming up 13 years ago now. This December will be 13 years. And I remember there were times when I could not even talk about her without getting choked up and just bawling, right? And then there were times where I would see something that reminded me of her and it would make me tear up. And so I just think about, in the same way that you were at a beach, there's times when the wave is really crashing on the sand. And then there's times when the wave just gently touches the sand and comes back. And I think in that same way, grief happens to us. So grief leaves this hole in our life that can never be filled. Like the hole will always be there. I will always miss my grandmother. I will always remember, even if they, Lord willing, cure lupus, I will always remember what it was like to live with lupus. But the thing that helps us is that your life grows around it. So it's not just this hole that, is this big and there's like a little bit of life around it. If you're doing life right, you continue to build life around that hole. So even though it's the same size, you have so much life around it as well. And so what that means and why I love the language of warrior that we often use is I really do believe we're not just fighting for our lives in terms of life and death, but we're fighting for our lives in terms of the quality of that life, right? So, how are you going to be kind to yourself, right? Which can show up as a form of one of the stages of grief in terms of bargaining, but just really understanding, okay, I cannot do a full on marathon, right? That would not be the best thing for me. But I can decide, you know what? I'm going to run a mile and a half because my body's able allowing me to do that. Or even this morning, before our session today, I was in the gym and I felt great and strong, but there was a moment where my body said, "We're done." And it wasn't everything I had on my list to do that day, but I said, "You know what, body? You are right. Let's go have breakfast." And so that was it. And so just understanding how you're going to have this kindness toward yourself, this grace toward yourself that allows you to be kind to other people, that allows you to be gracious to other people in spite of the pain, physical and emotional, that we carry. Because the grief that we have in this community isn't just something that's emotional. We can feel it in our bones, literally.
Love the analogy of the hole and growing things around it because it's not just something that you can plug and step on and get over. And I've had experiences, I'm mourning something. People were like, you should be over this by now. You need to accept this and
Right.
move on. So you also bring up a good point about it not being linear and love the wave analogy because it's not just go through the steps and move on. And sitting on this side of it, it can be easy to be like, yeah, you went through it, but now you need to look at the positive side of things and keep moving
Yeah.
forward.
That's so real. I think people have, and we do this with all forms of grief, but there's almost like an expected window of grieving. There's so many cultures where you get news that someone has died. The community essentially closes itself, right? Like it stops functioning in its normal capacity. And there's a mourning period, right? Whether it's days or weeks. I'm in Jamaican culture where traditionally there was something called a nine night, right? So when someone died, there was 9 evenings of singing and drinking and meals and community gathering all around the life of this person, right? And the person would not be, eulogized or funeralized until almost a week and a half later, right? But you're just spending all this time talking about remembering, being grateful for this person. And so I think because of that, there's some expectation of like, we did that. Like like we did that back in February. It's August now. Why aren't you okay yet? And then when we add sort of the cultural expectations of getting back to normal, I think of, and I was having a great conversation with a friend of mine around the pandemic and talking about COVID and how much we needed a collective grieving period, because of the millions of people who died, but also there's for those of us who can remember it, there was a before and after line that was drawn because of that experience of, you can't go to the ball game, you can't go to the supermarket without having to come home and wash your fruit, like all these different ways that we were collectively traumatized. And I think that if you now see someone wearing a mask, sometimes people can be like, "Well, what's their problem? Like, are they okay?" But it wasn't. We're talking 5 years ago now, and that's very fresh. But still, there was this collective decision as a society and even as a world to say we have to move on. But I'm not so sure we were ready to move on. I don't know if we did what we need to do to actually deal with our grief. So grief doesn't just heal itself naturally. You have to be kind and nurturing to yourself and to others in order for us to be able to process grief in a productive way.
In the example of the funeral and celebrating life for 9 days and then collectively healing from COVID, it's not like that for an individual who's just diagnosed with autoimmune disease. We personally have to go through our own grieving
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, it's what really stayed with me, Karen, is after my first flare when I got diagnosed, I remember being so surprised that the world kept spinning because my world just felt destroyed. And I was like, oh, banks are open and people are going to school and just society has moved on. And you just kind of feel like, what did I miss? Like um, help me. I haven't been watching the news every day. Like I haven't kept up with what's going on. I've needed to deal with this. And there is a sense of life goes on as you are personally, you know, in this tragedy and just in this like personal collapse. I don't want to spoil this movie, but there's a brilliant film called The Life of Chuck, based on a Stephen King novel. And it's really understanding that when a person is sick, it is like the universe is collapsing because, we will say these things romantically or to a child, like, you're my world. But we really are worlds within ourselves, like all of the different experiences and the networks we have and the connection points we have, when ending, which is what illness is trying to do to us, it is like a whole world collapsing. And I think that it's very difficult to experience that or to even survive it and then see the, not even disrespectful, but just frank indifference to that the rest of the world has because the world persists in spite of what we're going through personally.
Universe collapsing, all that reminds me of a story when I was hospitalized from a life-threatening flare, and I had my immediate family was in the room with me, along with a couple doctors, and the doctors were asking me questions. I was responding, and the doctor stopped mid-sentence, turned away from me, and looked at my family, and goes, "Does she always talk this slow?" I had serious brain fog and other stuff
Yeah,
going
yeah,
on,
yeah.
but I was like, "You're not even acknowledging me as a person right now."
Right, right,
So, in the midst of my universe collapsing, I'm so worried I'm not gonna get home to my 2 kids and get back
right.
to normal
Normal.
life, and I just felt invisible in that
Yeah.
moment.
And that's something I love that you bring that up because it makes me think of the conversations we've had with, aspiring doctors, like going to speak to like medical schools and just reminding them that, I'm not just your 1230. That when you look at your docket for the day, you see however many appointments you have, each of those appointments represent a person who may be terrified, a person who may be anxious, a person who may be so frustrated, a person who feels like the weakest they've ever felt. And how are you going to maintain that person's dignity? I feel so sorry that you experienced that because what I see there is someone in the person of that doctor who needed to get whatever they needed to get going and wasn't able to have the sort of presence that theologically we'll talk about as like a ministry of presence, like meaning that you're just really sitting with a person while they're experiencing brain fog, while it's taking them a while to really communicate what they're trying to communicate. And that's why I'm talking about grief in equal measure to talking about this understanding of kindness and to understanding of having grace towards each other, because the patience that we need to demonstrate to people is a part of their healing from grief. So you can't look at someone who has now decided to sit in their room with the lights off in the middle of the summertime and it's a dark room all the time and just say, come on, let's go. Like, well, why are you still here? You need to do what you can to love that person to life and get them back into a space where you can get the light on, you can open the shades up, you can get them re-entered into society because the grief can feel like this casket before we're even deceased.
100%. The isolation is just deafening.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the worst. You think about how we are wired for community as a species. Like we form all these different groups and subgroups to feel, which is a common feeling for us in the autoimmune world, to feel like I have no one to talk to about this. Like no one understands me. I'm trying to talk to the doctor. The doctor is behind on their appointment, so they're kind of rushing me. My family's trying to pick up the pieces of like, I was contributing before this happened, right? Like I was helping to pay a bill. I was making meals. I was picking up whoever from soccer practice. Like there was all these things that are happening that I can no longer do. So that is now being redistributed by whatever my network is, friends or family or neighbors. They don't have the capacity to sit with me and really reason about all of this. So I'm just in my own head, or maybe I'm reading books, or maybe I'm going to support groups, but I don't know who these folks are yet. And it just is making me feel lower than I felt before I got onto the call. Like all these different ways that we can feel so isolated, but it's just so important for us to hold on to each other and to like get through this together. So I may be in a better place than I was, when I was first diagnosed or when I had a second flare, but I have a responsibility in my mind to be in community with folks who are experiencing this for the first time or are going through the worst time in their lives. Like we have to be in this together.
Love that because there were many years where I was like, "No, I'm just gonna do this on my own. I'm fine. No
Right.
worries. I got
Totally.
this." And then
Yeah.
it's like, "Nope, nope, I don't got this."
It's too much. It's too much, for sure.
So on the other side, you mentioned someone not having the capacity to sit with someone who's grieving. If I do have the capacity, what does that look like for me to support someone else who's grieving?
Yeah. I think giving folks the space to be listened to does so much for people. I think that we're in a world, regardless of your social location, that moves so fast that we are seldom listened to. A lot of us are talked at. And I think, particularly our most vulnerable, which includes people who are dealing with illness, don't get the luxury of being listened to enough. So just spending time listening to someone, letting someone say what they need to say can do wonders for their healing process. I think of when I've led support groups, I've often thought about them through the lens of catharsis, this need to let things out, right? It's why people do things like axe throwing and go to those, I don't even know what they call them, like damaged places where they just have the sledgehammer and they're breaking up an old car. People need to release the stress and anxiety. And I think even with having good conversation or just letting someone tell their story is an important step in that journey. You can't stay there. It can't just be about that, but it is an important step in it. And I think helping people see that they still have dignity, they still have worth, there's still something they can contribute. I think about all of the go-getters and folks who are really fast-paced mentally, who are afflicted with these conditions, and there's a tremendous sense of loss of status, right? I used to be able to run this meeting. I'm having so much brain fog, I can't remember what was next on the agenda, right? And all of the different ways that you can grieve that, but we all still have something that we can contribute. And so allowing people to say, okay, maybe you can't do this thing that you're used to doing, but I see how you could be beneficial in this capacity. Having the sort of flat hierarchy that says all of us are important. It's not just the one who's the captain, like every single member of this team is important, helps people restore their sense of dignity that's been stripped away by illness.
When you're in the thick of it, and I've seen this a lot with people soon after they've been diagnosed, it takes time to process. But how do you not get stuck in that grieving process?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think of it as like when your check engine light comes on, because we all have different capacities. And I think just really establishing a baseline with yourself. I see this and it can feel cheesy, it can feel very corny, but just really writing down each day, starting your day by being like, where am I today? Like, how do I feel? Right? Like, if you have sort of There's a map you can get with all the different like smiley faces and different adjectives. There's a wheel with all the different emotions that just you can find yourself there. So that way you get a sense of like where my normal is, right? Like not everyone is going to aspire to be a cheery person where they're just like, a Disney character all of a sudden. That's not everyone's baseline. But just understanding where your baseline is important so that you can notice, like, you know what? Now, I usually do have a dry humor and I'm kind of sarcastic, but I feel kind of mean today. Like, that joke has extra bite. Ooh, I said that real sharp and I did not mean to say it that sharp. But you're able to notice that if you're paying attention to yourself every day, right? Like, or because it can also be on the other end of it where you are that cheery person and you're always saying good morning, you're always very pleasant. And now you feel like you're having to perform that cheeriness rather than it coming from a genuine place. Like now it becomes a mask that you're trapped in rather than an expression of your true self. So I think the main key is to understand where your baseline is and understand if you're being true to that baseline. Do you have to force that, or are you unable to be that because of how you're actually feeling in that moment? And then assessing from there, like, what do I need to get back to my normal self?
I appreciate the self awareness piece because it can be easy to brush things under the rug and move on with the day to day. But being aware of your baseline and maybe journaling or however you want to figure out what that is, that can give us the barometer to be like, yes, I need to do more self work, more self kindness, any of that to help us get through.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and just I think something that stays with me is, as imperfect as it is, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top of it is self actualization, right? And Maslow believes only 2% of the population ever gets there. But I think it's worth aspiring toward understanding what does it mean to be my best self, right? It doesn't mean I'm going to be the best. I love basketball. I am not going to be LeBron or Anthony Edwards or Steph Curry. But understanding that I can push myself to be the best that I can be in a variety of different ways. So if it means that I want to be someone who loves to read, what is the best I can do? Does that mean I'm finishing a whole novel every day? Probably not. But does it mean I'm maybe reading a novel a month? Possibly, right? So just finding out what it means to be my best self. And I think that when we take that understanding of self actualization and apply it to grief, it gives us a hopeful posture, which I think is the antidote for being trapped in grief. Grief, in and of itself, is not a negative thing, it is a proper response to loss, right? And I think, especially when you think about when we lose things that we love, the amount of grief that we have isn't a negative thing. It's really evidence of how profound the love was and remains, right? So it's not a bad thing to be in grief, but where it does become problematic is when we can't get out of grief, when grief becomes a bed rather than a place where we sit from time to time. And I think that that's really the way that we have to think about it in terms of how am I visiting grief because I can't afford to live here.
Think that's beautiful because in those dark times, it can be really hard to find hope and faith, knowing that this will pass
Yeah,
and it will get better. It
right.
will look different, but we'll move on.
Totally.
Asking yourself that single question, how can I be my best self today? And what do I want that to look like? It doesn't matter who you used to be and what that used to look like.
Right.
It matters starting today. To your point, that gives you agency to shift from that stuck in the old ways or the past, but now I'm focusing on my future and looking ahead.
Totally. Totally. There's something about living your life in the present, right? So if you are only future oriented, you may never appreciate what's here today, right? So you're like, "Oh, I'm listening to this podcast, but I can't wait for tomorrow because tomorrow is going to be X, Y, and Z." No, understanding that there's something beautiful about this moment right now. If you're trapped in the past and trapped in nostalgia, that you're never able to appreciate how things are good. Things were so much better back then. But what about the good that's happening now? And so there's something about while we're being hopeful and maybe even being like future oriented, we're still living in the present.
In those dark times, there's not a better tool to teach you appreciation for the present moment. I knew I was going to get out of that hospital room. Once I got home, it was like, man, this is so nice.
Truly.
Yeah. Finding that appreciation in after those dark times has become easier for me because I
Hmm.
know how bad it can be.
No, and that's such a health. I love that you lift that up because that's such a healthy disposition where you can expand your gratitude because of what you've gone through, right? So it doesn't just become like, man, like I'm just doing this mundane thing. You know what it's like to not be able to do this mundane, routine, tedious thing where you could not. I think about in my experience, like having to like relearn how to walk because of all that lupus had done to me. And I could not walk from my hospital bed to the bathroom unassisted, right? So it makes me appreciate, as corny as it may sound to someone who can't understand it, it makes me appreciate every step because I know what it's like to look at an escalator and get scared. Like, how am I going to walk up that escalator? Or look at like a flight of stairs going down and be like, am I going to be able to do this safely? And now being able to do those things unassisted makes me overwhelmed with gratitude.
It's an incredible experience, but in the moment, it can be hard to know there is going to be a silver lining that comes out
Absolutely.
of this.
Yeah. It's because it's just all that's wrong is so wrong. It's like loudly wrong. It's not quiet about it at all.
Yeah. One thing that I think exacerbates grief is comparing yourself to others and where they are on their journeys. I even remember being early on in my journey and seeing others further along and being like, oof, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to be able to be like that
Right.
person. So, how do we deal with trying not to compare ourselves to others when we are in such a state of loss?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's powerful. I think comparison is a thief, and it will steal your joy if you allow it to. Because I cannot be you, and you cannot be me, right? And there's so many gifts that every single person on the planet has, regardless of how unwell they may be. That if we continue to just look at the next person's paper and just say like, oh, they're so good at that, you will miss what you're good at. You will miss the qualities you have. And I think, especially in moments of great difficulty, you realize how you're not just defined by what you do for a living. You're not just defined by the things you produce. There are qualities you have, even in a hospital bed where you cannot make a profit for anyone else. Like your job is to just sit there with the IV in your hand, in your arm, and just, wait for further instructions. There are still qualities that you have. And I think when you're able to appreciate yourself and not define yourself by what you produce or by the possessions you have, then you're able to achieve a deeper peace than if you say, I have meaning because I am the president of this company, or I have meaning because I'm able to take my kids on vacation in this beautiful location, or I have meaning because I'm able to provide this to this community. But understand that, like, even without those things, you still have meaning. Those things are the fruit of you living into your purpose, perhaps, but they are not the core essence of who you are. And I think when we're able to do that, we can once again be kind to ourselves and say, like, this hospital bed is just a season. It's not where I'm going to live forever, you know?
Chris, from your experience as a pastor and coaching, what other aspects of grief should we look at?
I think it's really important to pay attention to the grief that caregivers are providing. I think it's weary to provide care in the sense of it's one thing you and I have done going through it. It is a whole different kind of horror to watch someone you love suffer. And I think while they're suffering, they're also trying to keep things running, keep things afloat. Maybe they have to work so that, you can continue to receive, insurance coverage. Maybe they're trying to put together a schedule for the kids so that they don't feel it too much, or they're trying to get the meals, or whatever the case is. I think allowing the caregivers to have the space to process what they have lost as well. Maybe they've lost a partner, maybe they've lost a parent, maybe they've lost a child who they had so much hope for in terms of, the sky being the limit. And just allowing them to have the space and being in the support of folks who can help them process it in a healthy way. Because when left untreated, it can become a source of shame for that person who's going through it. I remember feeling very vividly a sense of I let people down by being sick. Like I very much felt like I had failed them. And I think if we don't take care of the folks who are giving care, they can communicate that implicitly or explicitly. And so I think that making sure that caregivers receive the sort of grief counseling that they need to be able to be a part of the healing process and not furthering the wound is important.
I appreciate you bringing that up. They often call these diseases family diseases because they're so impactful. And I think it can be easy for us who are in it
Right.
to forget that they're going through a grieving process too. I could imagine that there's feelings of needing to put on a brave face and they're going to handle it all because you are so sick. And that is so much pressure. And
Yeah,
it's a lot to take on in addition to the grief of the loss of the former relationship or whatever it used to look like.
totally. Totally. It can be, I mean, we see this, like we've seen families fall apart during times of illness. We've seen folks not be able to make it work and it looks bad, right? Like to say like, oh, we're getting a divorce like while this person's sick or whatever the case is, but it's because, it can be such a crushing weight if you don't have the proper support.
So, Chris, what else do we need to or should we cover around grief?
Yeah, I think understanding and emphasizing the importance of community, that grief was never meant to be bore alone. I think so many cultures around the world do this well. Individualism has its benefits, but I think in terms of individualism within our culture in the States, it can be very, very difficult for folks when they're grieving because we have this sense of it's up to you. And I think that we get through grief together, not by ourselves.
I appreciate that because our culture very much is everyone should be an entrepreneur or CEO, the
Hmm.
top of the top.
Right.
Regardless of that, it's the community around us that is going to help us get through whatever that we're going through.
Yeah. So just remind yourself and remind others that we don't have to do this by ourselves. Like find rhythms and do this. I think we prepare for tragedy in good times, right? So it's almost like understanding, like, that old kid story about the grasshopper and the ants, right? The ants saw that it was summertime, and so they said, we need to work because winter's coming. And the grasshopper was like, it's great, I'm chilling. What y'all up to, ants? I'm not gonna do any work. And then the grasshopper starves to death in the winter, and the ants have more than enough. I think in times when things are good, when someone comes across your mind, send them a text, give them a phone call. Say, hey, you want to grab some coffee? You want to grab some lunch? Let's go watch that new movie. Whatever the case is, do that in healthy times. Nurture the relationships you have. And it's not just in case, but when you do that work, it allows the difficult times to be easier because you already have the rhythms rather than having stale relationships that you're like, hey, we haven't talked in a long time, but guess what? Like, we don't want to do that. That's where it becomes so much more difficult because also who you were 10 years ago is not who you are today. And so allowing each of us to deal with how our loved ones and our friends and our community members are evolving, because part of that dynamic that can get so flustering for families is thinking that you are still the person I knew years ago. You're still the child that I raised. You're still the person I first met back in high school. we can't be those people. It's impossible. So allowing those relationships evolve over time so that that sense of loss in those relationships is mitigated and our sense of how to deal with grief together can be enhanced.
It's such an important point because through that community and the continuous self growth through self kindness, that all takes time. Going back to community, it can take time to find the right people who understand what you're going through. Because I've said before, you can have the best support network in the world, but if they truly aren't understanding what you're going through from a health perspective, in our case, sometimes you just need more.
No question. No question. Yeah, it's just really putting everyone in the best position is how I'm thinking about it for sure.
Chris, thank you for talking through this deep but very important conversation today. Anyone who is going through a hard time, please reach out to us. We're here for you. Like Chris said, you do not have to do this alone, and you should not have to do this alone. Chris, thank you so much for being here. Is there any last thing you want to add?
But yeah, I mean, just as I often say on Instagram and TikTok, just be kind to each other. That's really it. Just this, it's really that simple. You don't know what people are carrying, so just choose kindness.
Always need that reminder. Thank you. To our community, we appreciate you. Know that we're here for you in any way, shape, or form. Drop us a note, comment, DM. We'll get back to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Peace.